Hey guys, it's Jonny. I recently got back from my summer travels, and so today's video is going to be about the first stop on my summer travels, which was Turkey. I spent about 3 days in Istanbul, which is a wonderful city, and I saw the number of tourists that come in there. And whilst in the city, I noticed a lot of places where tourists could perhaps end up paying more money than they need to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, or unfortunately in some cases because they've been scammed. So in this video, as well as sharing my experience in the city, I'm going to tell you about 5 ways you can avoid the tourist tax in Istanbul and make sure that you don't overpay for things while you're visiting. So let's get right into the video. For those that are not familiar with Turkey, it is in both Europe and Asia, and it borders a lot of countries such as Greece, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Turkey has a population of about 70 million people, and the currency is the Turkish lira. More on that a bit later in the video. Now, Istanbul is the biggest city in Turkey, but it's not the capital. The capital of Turkey is Ankara. And what's very interesting about the city is that part of it is in Europe, and the other half is in Asia, and it's joined by multiple bridges that take you across from the European continent, the European side of Istanbul, over to Asia, the Anatolian side of the city. And so that brings us to the first point where you can look to save money, and that's on transportation. Now, because Istanbul is such a big city, the public transport network is quite good, and most of the city is pretty well connected, whether it's by bus, metro, tramway, or even ferry as well. Now, some of these journeys do take a while depending on where you're going. The average journey that I took was typically between 40 and 50 minutes, depending on where I was going, because I was traveling, across the whole of the city and trying to visit everything in 3 days, which was very ambitious. But a standard ride on the metro, on the tram, or on the bus is about 30 Turkish lira, which is about $1, €1 essentially. As I said as well, there's also a ferry that takes you across the river from various points, whether you're crossing from Europe to the Anatolian side or from the Anatolian side back to the European side, and that costs about 60 Turkish lira. So again, not very expensive at all, about €2, $2. I personally find those river crossings very good value for money. You can sit on the boat, you can look across, you can see across the river, the bridges, you can see all of the main sites. Whereas, there are cruises where you get, maybe a fine dining experience or a sunset or an early morning cruise, or you'll pay about 20 or 25 euros for that. When personally, I think you can get a similar experience, which is equally as enjoyable, just by taking the normal ferry crossing for about, €2, as I said. With all the public transportation, you don't necessarily need cash. You can get the Istanbul travel card, or you can pay by your contactless card. You can touch in when you go into the station or when you get on the ferry, and your card will be charged the corresponding fee. The only exception to that is the new metro line to the airport, which I wanted to try out, but long story short, I wasn't able to get hold of cash that I needed when it was time to travel to the airport, and I ended up taking a taxi, unfortunately. Speaking of taxis, there are a lot of taxis around Istanbul, and there are also taxi scams where, you could get in an illegitimate taxi, or you could get in a taxi and the driver overcharges you because you didn't agree on the fare, or because he, you saw you as a tourist and he decided to take advantage of that. Now, the best way to get around this, which I found, was to book yellow taxis that are authorized, that have a license plate from the city, through official apps. My preferred one being Uber. Uber, it's very easy to operate. You can book your taxi, you know when the driver's going to turn up, you know where they'll pick you up, and you know that the fare that's on the screen is what you're going to pay. Actually, in the worst case scenario, most cases, the fare that they quote you for the trip, it will more than likely end up at the bottom end of that range that they quote you. There is another app available called Buy Taxi, which works in a similar way. However, I am a bit reluctant to recommend it because despite using it, again, to try and avoid these taxi scams, I still ended up getting overcharged on a journey from the airport. I did try it on another occasion, and on the other occasion, it was okay. Everything worked out fine. What you got to make sure if you use this app is that you use it with taxi meter off. And that means that whenever the taxi driver comes to look for you, the meter only starts when you're picked up. It doesn't start when they're on the way to pick you up. And I think that's how I got overcharged on my first trip from the airport to where I was traveling to. With Buy Taxi as well, you can see what the average rate per kilometer is for the different types of taxis. Now, for the yellow taxis that I mentioned, typically, depending on where you're going and how far you're traveling, you shouldn't expect to pay more than 12 to 15 lira per kilometer. So for example, I stayed in Besiktas, which is about 40 kilometers from the airport. So I should have paid about 600 Turkish lira, which is about 20-25 euros. So as you can see, if you use the proper apps, then you can get taxis at a good price. And if you're a big group of people, then that works out quite nicely, dividing the cost between people. And it's also generally a lot quicker, than the public transport as well. If you're trying to get from one side of Istanbul, the Anatolian side, to the European or vice versa, then of course, in some cases, it makes more sense to just take a taxi because of the time that it takes on the public transport. Obviously, to use apps like Uber and Buy Taxi, when you're out and about, you will need some mobile data. One of the services that I used while I was traveling is UBG. Now, this is an eSIM that I downloaded, and it has a range of deals that can be used all across the world. For example, I could use a Europe extended package, which costs me 9 euros for 1 gigabyte, which is valid for 30 days. There was also a Turkey package, which is 3 gigabytes for 18 euros, again valid for 30 days. And I can do that by simply downloading the eSIM to my phone, selecting the package I want to use, setting my data provider to UBG, and away I go. I have data at a good rate in Turkey where I can use it to communicate, I can use it for the taxi apps, etc. So if you're traveling particularly across multiple countries and you're looking for a cost-effective data solution, then I'll leave my link to UBG in the video description for you to sign up. Next thing I'm going to talk about is currency exchange. Now, whenever you go to a foreign country and you're using a currency that's not your own, of course you have to think about money exchange. Of course, don't change money in the airport, you will get terrible rates there, but even at physical bureau de change in the city, you may not get the best rate possible. Whenever I go traveling, I use my Wise card. Now, I've been a Wise client for many, many years. I've used it for cross-border transactions, and more recently, I've used the Wise debit card where I need to use a different currency. In the case of Turkey, I was able to top up my Wise card with Turkish lira at a competitive rate, and at certain ATMs, such as this HSBC one that you'll see on the screen, I was able to withdraw that cash without any commission in the country. So if you're interested in finding more about Wise, I did a video where I talked more in depth about how it works, and if it's something that might help you on your travels, I'll leave my link again in the video description for you to go and check it out. Next, let's talk about food, and there was a range of fantastic tasting food all across the city at very affordable prices as well, depending on where you go. In my case, I went to standard neighborhood restaurants, nothing fancy, anything like that, and I honestly, not kidding, never paid more than 7 euros for a meal, and I was getting good quantities. I'm going to put some examples on the screen for you now. You can see this pasta dish didn't cost me more than 120 Turkish lira. I ate 2 big slices of pizza for about 200 liras, fried chicken and chips for about 250 Turkish lira, a kebab again for about 260 Turkish lira. So converting these costs back to euros, as you can see, on average cost me about 5 or 6 euros, the cheapest being about 3 euros and the most being about 7. Unfortunately, it's very easy to fall into the tourist trap of going to a restaurant which is right near, for example, the Hagia Sophia Mosque, the Blue Mosque, or in, one of the touristy areas. And some guy tried to get me to go into his restaurant, and I looked at the menu and I saw kebabs for like 600 Turkish lira, which is about 15-20 euros, and I was like, come on, man. And I kid you not, I walked 5-10 minutes to a much smaller restaurant and I paid, about 200 Turkish lira for the same thing. So a third of what this guy in the tourist area was charging. So guys, please don't get ripped off in the tourist areas. The best priced food, you can find it in some of the smaller neighborhoods. You can find it, in the back streets away from the tourist areas. And also in the shopping centers and the malls, you'll find reasonable prices as well. The two that I visited were the Palladium Shopping Center and the Emaar Square Mall. And the Emaar Square Mall, by the way, well worth a visit. very impressive mall, very cool, got some very high-end shops. It's got some really nice things in it as well. And the last place where you can save money that I want to talk about is the Grand Bazaar. Now, Istanbul is fascinating in the sense that you can be walking in the center of the city and it looks like a modern European capital. But at the same time, in the same city, just a few kilometers away, you have much more traditional, Middle Eastern looking neighborhoods, which are, I find that fascinating. And it's in some of those more Middle Eastern looking neighborhoods that you'll find places like the Grand Bazaar or the Egyptian Bazaar. And there are a range of goods, spices, perfumes, sweets, clothing, jewelry that you can find there as well. And having spoken to my Airbnb host, he did tell me that it's a place where, a lot of tourists again get ripped off because of the high prices, because they may not know exactly what to expect in terms of price, and so essentially they end up overpaying for things. Now, I went to the Grand Bazaar myself and I bought some baklava, and I apparently still overpaid, but I did manage to negotiate. And I think this is a key tactic if you do go to the Grand Bazaar. If you do see something that you like, do not be afraid to negotiate, and negotiate hard. It's a place to barter, it's a place to haggle, it's a place to try and get a better price. So don't be afraid to give it a go. Alternatively, you may just want to have a walk through and have a look at what's on offer, but then go and see if you can find it out there, because there are loads of, baklava or Turkish delight stores around the city as well. There are chains available where you can buy good quality sweets. You can find gifts and souvenirs all over the city as well. So overall, I had a great time in Istanbul. Probably didn't spend enough time to be able to see everything. I did feel like I rushed a little bit to try and see everything there was to do in 3 days. But I would definitely go back. And Turkey itself is not limited to Istanbul. I'd love to visit other places in the country as well and see what that's like as well. And this is just the first video from my summer travel series. There are more videos coming on the destinations that I visited after Istanbul. So absolutely stay tuned and do not miss them. In the meantime though, leave a comment. Have you been to Istanbul or have you been to anywhere else in Turkey? And what has been your experience when it comes to spending money in Turkey? Next time, I'll see you on the next one. And let's get this money.